Hello, welcome to the Old State House Museum's Collections Podcast. I'm Danielle Fletcher.
And I'm Josh Jenkins. And we are two of the collection staff members here at the Old State House Museum. At the Old State House, we have a large variety of collections, and they all relate to the building in some way, shape, or form. The Old State House, though it was the original state capitol building, it's also been the headquarters for the state police and various organizations. Well, we have a large Arkansas State Police collection. We also came into possession of the Department of Correction collection.
That's right. They had, for years, been collecting artifacts, and when we came around to doing the Law and Justice exhibit, which is called Badges, Bandits, and Bars, they basically acquired all these artifacts, but it had gotten to the place where they realized they could no longer care for the artifacts, and so decided to turn them over to the Old State House Museum.
That's right, and the Department of Correction collection is a huge part of the Badges, Bandits, and Bars exhibit, and in that exhibit, some of the highest profile items are some of the Department of Correction, or DOC items as we call it. Those include the two electric chairs,
yes,
and two of the death mask, which when I first encountered these objects, I honestly was kind of mortified to know that,
yes,
161 prisoners were executed in this chair. We decided for this podcast to bring in the person that knows the most about the Department of Correction collection, the spokeswoman for the Department of Correction, Dina Tyler.
She gave us a phenomenal interview. It was great, and we really appreciate her coming and doing this.
The Department of Correction has been around since the Constitution of Arkansas. And over the years, it's changed its name, changed its mission, but its main purpose has stayed the same. Well, through that time period, there have been many different incarnations of what it is, what it does, and the tools it uses to do that. Well, as it would change, people would just start saving things. And our facilities have changed. What inmates wear, what they do has changed. So everybody just started keeping things. It reached a point several years ago where the department actually opened its own little museum. I think it was the second prison museum in the country. Well, obviously, it got to be much more than we can handle because, as just about everybody knows, when you have artifacts, they have to be carefully maintained. Well, we're good at security, but we're not so good at maintaining artifacts, and so that's how it ended up going to the Old State House Museum. It was located where the Capitol sits now. We have a drawing that I think maybe an inmate did. And from the appearances of the drawing, it looks like it was situated the same way the Capitol is. Well, when they came and started building the Capitol, they started moving, obviously, the prison. The Capitol was actually built by inmate labor. If you go down in the basement at the Capitol, you'll see a whole bunch of pictures of inmates in stripes, because that's what they wore at the time. And I think down in the basement where those brick arches are, I've been told that those arches were made out of bricks from that original prison. I don't know if that's true or not. But so inmates were used to build that Capitol. When they moved from there, they moved to a location on Roosevelt Road where Troop A headquarters of state police now sits. And they built this massive structure called the walls because of the giant brick walls that went around it. That's all gone, with the exception of one partial wall. When they moved from there, inmates were taken to Cummins. As a matter of fact, the first inmates who went to Cummins were taken there by riverboat. They let him out on the levee and said, "Hello, you're home." There was no facility there. The inmates lived in these little bitty shacks, wooden shacks, that they made down by the river. And they lived like that until the 40s. There was a time when we were one of the, if not the worst prison system in the country. Well, how we got there was simple. It was money. Because in 1902, when Cummins opened, that was when Arkansas decided to shift from a convict lease system to a penal farm system. So they bought the Cummins and Maple Grove plantations, and then in 1914 or 16 they'd buy Tucker. And the idea was, we'll use these inmates to farm, and they can pay their own way. And by gosh, if we do this just cleverly enough, Arkansas might make some money off convicts. Not necessarily the state, but people made money. But to continue making money, then you cannot have a lot of employees. To avoid having a lot of employees, then you have to use inmates to watch other inmates. And that was the slippery slope. As a matter of fact, on display you've got the Tucker telephone. Everybody's heard of the Tucker telephone. That was not used by employees on inmates. Inmates on inmates. So it all came down to money. Arkansas spent very little on its penitentiary system back then. And then the end result was, finally, total unconstitutionality. Total. Back in 1913, the state took over executions for the counties. Before then, if you were sentenced to death, say in White County, then they took you out to the old hanging tree in White County, and White County put you to death. And it was that way for all the counties in Arkansas. In 1913, the legislature said, no, we want the prison system to do it, so that everybody is put to death the same way, in the same manner. And that manner at the time was electrocution. So there was actually a guy who was hired, a scientist, who was hired to make the first electric chair, Old Sparky 1. And that's the one where all but one of the inmates put to death by electrocution drew their last breath. In 1990, we had an inmate who had been sentenced under the old electrocution law, but Arkansas's method of execution had since changed to lethal injection. And he was given a choice. Do you want lethal injection or do you want the chair? Well, he refused to choose. So at that point, the state had no choice but to carry out the original judgment and commitment. So they brought in this second chair that had been made way back when, in like the 60s or 70s, by inmates. We don't even know how that started, but there was a period that seemed to be in the 30s and the 40s where death masks, these wax castings, were made following the execution of an inmate. But there was a time when many of these were displayed in State Police headquarters, I think off Roosevelt Road, if I'm not mistaken. We don't exactly know what happened to them. Apparently they were put in storage at some point. Somebody probably said, you know, this is kind of creepy. We really don't want these on display. And I don't know whether they all melted together and were discarded or they were lost or what happened. But we know of, I think, 2 that exist. Why they were made, I don't know, other than to serve as proof in some way that the execution took place.